The morning sun of March 22, 1944, cast long shadows across the Burmese jungle as squadron leader Charles "Charlie" Whitmore pulled his Supermarine Spitfire into a steep banking turn, his engine's Merlin roar cutting through the humid air like a blade through silk. Below him, the smoking wreckage of what had been a perfectly executed bombing mission was scattered across the green canopy, but it wasn't the destruction on the ground that made his heart pound against his ribs. It was the sight of the lone American B-24 Liberator limping through the sky ahead, trailing black smoke from two of its four engines, its fuselage riddled with holes large enough for a man to crawl through. The bomber's crew had radioed their position moments ago, their voices crackling with static and barely controlled panic as they reported they were going down. 3 men dead, hydraulics shot to pieces, and fuel bleeding into the sky like crimson tears. Protocol was clear. Whitmore's orders were to maintain radio silence, complete his reconnaissance sweep of Japanese positions near Mandalay, and return to base immediately. But as he watched the crippled American bomber struggle to stay airborne, something deep in his chest refused to let him turn away. He keyed his radio transmitter, knowing full well that every Japanese listening post within 50 miles would triangulate his position the moment he broke communication silence, and spoke words that would haunt Imperial Japanese intelligence analysts for the rest of the war. No one in the Royal Air Force's No. 2 Squadron knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the rulebook on fighter escort tactics and leave enemy strategists completely baffled about how a single British pilot had accomplished the impossible. Charlie Whitmore had grown up in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, the son of a sheep farmer whose hands were permanently stained with engine oil from the motorcycles he repaired in his spare time to make ends meet during the lean years between the wars. The Whitmore family had never been wealthy, never been remarkable, never been anything more than honest working people who believed in doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Charlie's father had served in the trenches during the Great War and returned home with a slight limp and an unshakable conviction that wars were fought by ordinary men who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Young Charlie had learned to fly by building model airplanes from scraps of wood and fabric, spending hours in the pastures behind their farmhouse launching his creations into the wind, and dreaming of the day he might soar above the clouds himself. When the war began in 1939, he was 22 years old working as a mechanic in Leeds and counting the days until his name came up for military service. The Royal Air Force accepted his application in the spring of 1940, and by Christmas of that year, he was learning to handle the controls of a de Havilland Tiger Moth training aircraft, his instructor constantly reminding him that precision and discipline would keep him alive, while recklessness would get him killed. Charlie proved to be a natural pilot, possessed of the rare combination of technical skill and intuitive understanding that separated good aviators from great ones. But what truly set him apart was his uncanny ability to think 3 moves ahead in aerial combat, anticipating enemy tactics and positioning himself for advantage before his opponents even realized the game had begun. By the time he earned his wings and his commission as a pilot officer, Charlie had demonstrated a peculiar talent for improvisation under pressure, a quality his commanding officers noted in his file with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between 8 American airmen and certain death in the jungles of Burma. The war in the Pacific had reached a critical juncture by early 1944, with Allied forces beginning their methodical advance toward the Japanese home islands while simultaneously fighting to break the deadlock in Burma and reopen supply lines to China. The Japanese Empire, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, had adopted increasingly desperate defensive tactics, throwing their remaining experienced pilots into savage battles against overwhelming Allied air superiority. In Burma, The strategic situation had become a complex chess match between General William Slim's British 14th Army, supported by American and Chinese forces, and the Japanese Burma Area Army under Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe. Control of the skies above this mountainous, jungle-covered theater meant the difference between victory and stalemate, as both sides relied heavily on air transport to supply their ground forces across terrain that made conventional logistics nearly impossible. The Royal Air Force's No. 2 Squadron, based at an airfield carved from rice paddies near Chittagong, flew daily missions deep into Japanese-held territory, their Spitfires tasked with everything from ground attack sorties against enemy supply lines to high-altitude reconnaissance flights over heavily defended positions. American B-24 Liberator bombers from the 10th Air Force regularly coordinated with British fighter units for long-range strikes against Japanese installations, but the complex nature of these joint operations often led to communication breakdowns and tactical confusion. Standard operating procedure called for strict adherence to predetermined flight plans and radio silence protocols, designed to prevent Japanese interceptors from using Allied transmissions to vector their fighters into attack positions. Squadron Leader Whitmore had flown 67 combat missions over Burma and had seen enough good men die because of rigid adherence to protocol to understand that sometimes survival required thinking beyond the boundaries of regulation and doctrine. The mathematics of aerial warfare in the Burma theater were unforgiving. Allied pilots who flew by the book lived longer on average, but those who could adapt and improvise in real time were the ones who brought their wingmen home alive. The morning of March 22nd had begun like any other combat day, with Charlie awakening before dawn to the sound of monsoon rain drumming against the corrugated metal roof of his quarters, the humid air thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the distant smoke from cooking fires in nearby villages. The briefing room was crowded with pilots studying maps and weather reports, their faces grim as they absorbed details about their assigned targets, a Japanese supply depot near Mai-Itkaena, and suspected enemy troop concentrations along the Irrawaddy River. Charlie's mission was different, a solo reconnaissance flight to photograph Japanese positions around Mandalay, a task that would take him deep into enemy-controlled airspace, with nothing but his own skill and his Spitfire's speed to keep him alive. As he walked toward his aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, his boots squelching in the mud, Charlie felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded every combat mission, knowing that each flight might be his last, but also knowing that the intelligence he gathered could save the lives of countless Allied soldiers on the ground. His crew chief, Sergeant Tom Bradley, had worked through the night to ensure the Spitfire was in perfect mechanical condition, checking and double-checking every system, every connection, every moving part that would need to function flawlessly in the heat of battle. The two men had developed a ritual over months of flying together. Bradley would tap the propeller hub 3 times for luck, while Charlie performed his pre-flight inspection, and neither man ever acknowledged the superstition aloud. As Charlie strapped himself into the cockpit and felt the familiar embrace of his parachute harness and oxygen mask, he reviewed his flight plan one final time. Proceed southeast to the target area, maintain radio silence except for emergencies, photograph the designated positions, and return to base by 1100 hours. He had no way of knowing that within the next 2 hours he would face a choice that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and the value of human life. And then the engine coughed to life with a sound like controlled thunder, and Charlie taxied toward the runway, unaware that this morning would transform him from just another fighter pilot into a legend that Japanese intelligence officers would puzzle over for decades to come. At 0730 hours, Charlie lifted off into skies that seemed peaceful, despite the war raging below, his Spitfire climbing steadily through layers of tropical clouds that glowed pink and gold in the early morning sun. The flight to his target area proceeded without incident, his aircraft performing perfectly as he navigated by compass, heading and dead reckoning, staying below radar coverage, and avoiding known anti-aircraft positions. For 45 minutes, he flew through increasingly hostile territory, photographing Japanese installations and troop movements with the methodical precision that had made him one of the squadron's most reliable reconnaissance pilots. It was at 08:15 as he completed his final photographic run and prepared to turn for home, that his radio crackled to life with an American voice thick with desperation and fear. The transmission came from call sign Liberator 77, and an American B-24 bomber crew reporting catastrophic battle damage and requesting immediate assistance from any Allied aircraft in the area. Charlie's standing orders were explicit: maintain radio silence and avoid engagement with enemy forces unless directly attacked. But as he listened to the American pilot describe his situation, something in the man's voice made it impossible to simply fly away. The B-24 had been hit by Japanese fighters during a bombing run against railroad bridges near Lashio. 3 crew members were confirmed dead. Both port engines were destroyed. The hydraulic system was completely shot out, and they were losing fuel so rapidly that reaching any Allied airfield seemed impossible. Worse yet, the bomber pilot reported seeing Japanese fighters forming up for another attack, drawn by the smoke trail from his damaged aircraft like sharks, following a blood scent through water. Charlie knew that breaking radio silence to respond would reveal his position to every Japanese listening post within 100 miles, turning his reconnaissance mission into a suicide run. But he also knew that 8 American airmen were about to die if someone didn't help them. He thought about his father's words about ordinary men finding extraordinary courage, about Sergeant Bradley's 3 taps on the propeller for luck, about all the times he had made it home safely because someone had bent the rules to help him when he needed it most. And then he keyed his transmitter and spoke the words that would change everything. Liberator 77, this is Royal Air Force Spitfire, Charlie 15. I have you in sight and am moving to escort position. The response from the American bomber pilot was immediate and filled with desperate gratitude. Charlie 15, thank God you're here. We've got Zeros forming up behind us, and we can't maneuver worth a damn in this condition. Charlie could see the enemy fighters now, 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters climbing in perfect formation, their pilots clearly confident that they were about to claim an easy victory against a crippled bomber that couldn't fight back effectively. What the Japanese pilots didn't know was that they were about to encounter a Royal Air Force fighter pilot who had just decided to throw away every rule in the book to save 8 men he had never met. Charlie pushed his throttle forward and felt the Merlin engine respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat, the Spitfire accelerating toward the climbing Zeros with deadly intent. His plan was simple in concept, but incredibly dangerous in execution. He would use his superior speed and maneuverability to break up the Japanese formation before they could mount a coordinated attack on the bomber, then stay close to the B-24 and pick off any enemy fighters that tried to close in for the kill. The first Zero never saw him coming. Charlie dove out of the sun and opened fire with his 420mm cannons, the explosive shells tearing through the Japanese fighter's wing root and engine cowling in a shower of sparks and debris. The Zero rolled over and began its final dive toward the jungle below, trailing smoke and flame, while its 5 remaining wingmen scattered in confusion at this unexpected development. Charlie used their momentary disorganization to position himself between the enemy fighters and the damaged bomber, his Spitfire weaving back and forth in a defensive pattern that forced the Japanese pilots to engage him rather than concentrate their fire on the helpless B-24. For the next 20 minutes, the sky above the Burmese jungle became a 3-dimensional battlefield where Charlie demonstrated flying skills that bordered on the supernatural, somehow managing to keep 6 enemy fighters at bay, while staying close enough to the bomber to provide effective protection. The mathematics of the engagement should have been simple. 6 against 1 meant certain death for the outnumbered British pilot. But Charlie had discovered something that Japanese tactical doctrine hadn't accounted for. A fighter pilot with nothing to lose and everything to gain could accomplish things that seemed impossible on paper. Every time the Zeros tried to coordinate an attack on the bomber, Charlie would dive into their formation, forcing them to break off or risk collision, his cannons chattering in short, precise bursts that claimed another victim with almost mechanical regularity. The second Zero fell to a head-on attack that left Charlie's windscreen cracked by enemy gunfire, the Japanese pilot's last burst missing his engine by inches before the fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame. The third went down during a turning fight that lasted almost 5 minutes, Charlie using his Spitfire's superior turning radius to gradually work his way onto the Zero's tail, finally scoring hits on the fighter's fuel tank that sent it spinning earthward in a spiral of black smoke. But the remaining 3 Japanese pilots were learning from their fallen comrades' mistakes, adapting their tactics to account for Charlie's unconventional defensive strategy, and he could feel his ammunition running low with every trigger pull. Meanwhile, the American bomber crew was fighting their own desperate battle against mechanical failure and gravity. The pilot and co-pilot struggling to keep their shot-up aircraft airborne while the navigator tried to plot a course to the nearest Allied airfield that might be within their dwindling fuel range. Over the radio, Charlie could hear the strain in their voices as they dealt with one crisis after another, a fire in the bomb bay that threatened to cook off their remaining ammunition, hydraulic fluid leaking into the cockpit and making the controls increasingly unresponsive, and the constant fear that one of the 2 remaining engines would fail completely and send them all into an uncontrolled dive. The bomber's gunners were doing their best to fight back against the circling Zeros, but their fields of fire were limited by battle damage, and they were running low on ammunition after the initial attack that had crippled their aircraft. Charlie realized that time was running out for all of them. His fuel gauge showed he had perhaps 10 minutes of combat flying left before he would be forced to break off the engagement, and the bomber was losing altitude steadily despite the crew's best efforts to maintain level flight. That was when he made a decision that violated every principle of fighter tactics he had ever learned, a choice so audacious that it would be studied in military academies for generations to come. Instead of continuing to fight a defensive battle against the remaining 3 Zeros, Charlie suddenly turned toward the nearest Japanese fighter and opened fire at maximum range, not trying to score a kill, but simply to get the enemy pilot's attention and draw him into a pursuit. The Japanese pilot took the bait immediately, peeling away from his formation to chase what appeared to be a fleeing British fighter, his wingman following close behind in what they assumed would be the final phase of a successful interception. But Charlie wasn't fleeing. He was leading all 3 enemy fighters away from the bomber on purpose, sacrificing his own tactical position to buy the American crew precious minutes to limp towards safety. For 15 minutes, he played a deadly game of aerial tag with 3 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced fighter pilots, using every trick he had learned in 67 previous combat missions to stay ahead of their guns while gradually drawing them farther and farther away from the damaged B-24. He flew through valleys between mountain peaks, using the terrain to break visual contact when the enemy got too close, then popping up in unexpected places to fire quick bursts that kept the Japanese pilots focused on him rather than thinking about returning to finish off the bomber. His fuel gauge dropped toward empty, and his ammunition counter showed only a few rounds remaining. But still, he continued the chase, leading his pursuers on a wild ride through some of the most dangerous airspace in Southeast Asia. Finally, when his fuel warning light began to glow red, and he knew he couldn't maintain the pursuit much longer, Charlie executed one final maneuver that would be talked about in Royal Air Force messes for decades afterward. He turned directly towards the lead Japanese fighter in what appeared to be a head-on suicide attack, both aircraft closing on each other at a combined speed of more than 600 miles per hour, their guns firing simultaneously as they hurtled toward an inevitable collision. At the last possible second, Charlie pulled up and to the right, while the Japanese pilot broke left. But the British pilot had timed his maneuver perfectly. The Zero's left wing clipped the Spitfire's landing gear, sending both aircraft tumbling through the sky in a shower of twisted metal and shattered plastic. Charlie's fighter was damaged, but still flyable. The Zero was not so fortunate, its pilot bailing out moments before the fighter crashed into the jungle canopy in a spectacular explosion that sent smoke rising thousands of feet into the morning sky. The remaining 2 Japanese fighters broke off their pursuit and headed for home, their fuel also running low, and their pilots apparently unwilling to continue the engagement against an enemy who had just demonstrated a willingness to ram their aircraft rather than allow them to escape. Charlie turned his damaged Spitfire toward the last known position of the American bomber, his radio crackling with transmissions as he tried to re-establish contact with the B-24 crew. What he heard when the American pilot's voice came through the static filled him with a combination of relief and amazement. Not only had the bomber crew managed to reach Allied territory, but they had successfully landed at a forward airstrip near Imphal, all 8 surviving crew members walking away from their shot-up aircraft with nothing worse than cuts and bruises. The bomber pilot's voice was thick with emotion as he thanked Charlie for saving their lives, explaining that the 15 minutes the British fighter pilot had bought them by drawing away the Japanese fighters had been just enough time to coax their dying aircraft over the last mountain range and into Allied airspace. Without that crucial interval, they would have been shot down over Japanese-held territory with no hope of rescue or survival. Charlie's own flight back to base became an exercise in emergency flying as his damaged Spitfire struggled to maintain altitude and airspeed, fuel leaking from his punctured tanks and engine oil pressure dropping steadily as he nursed the aircraft across miles of hostile territory. He made it back to Chittagong with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining, touching down on the runway as his engine coughed and wheezed its last breath, smoke pouring from the cowling as he rolled to a stop in front of a fire truck and a crowd of ground crew members who had been monitoring his emergency frequency. Sergeant Bradley was the first to reach the cockpit, helping Charlie out of his harness and onto the wing of his battered fighter, both men grinning despite the serious damage to the aircraft they had spent so many months maintaining together. But even as Charlie climbed down from his Spitfire and began the process of debriefing with his squadron commander, he had no idea that his actions that morning had created a tactical puzzle that would confound Japanese intelligence analysts for the remainder of the war. The immediate aftermath of Charlie's unauthorized escort mission was surprisingly muted. His squadron commander, Wing Commander James Harrison, listened to the combat report with a mixture of admiration and exasperation, clearly torn between recommending Charlie for a decoration and court-martialing him for violating direct orders. The official paperwork described the engagement in carefully neutral terms, noting that Squadron Leader Whitmore had encountered enemy fighters while returning from his reconnaissance mission and had engaged them in self-defense, making no mention of the American bomber or the deliberate decision to break radio silence and provide escort. Behind the scenes, however, word of Charlie's actions spread quickly through the Allied air commands in Southeast Asia, with American intelligence officers particularly interested in debriefing the B-24 crew about their experience. The bomber's pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Bob Morrison from Cleveland, Ohio, provided a detailed account of how the British fighter pilot had single-handedly fought off 6 Japanese Zeros using tactics that seemed to defy conventional wisdom about air-to-air combat. According to Morrison's report, the British pilot had somehow managed to engage multiple enemy fighters simultaneously while maintaining a protective position around the damaged bomber, switching between offensive and defensive maneuvers with split-second timing that suggested an almost supernatural understanding of aerial tactics. More importantly, the American crew reported that the Japanese fighters had broken off their attack and fled the area rather than continue the engagement, a behavioral pattern that contradicted everything Allied intelligence knew about Japanese fighter doctrine. For months afterward, intercepted Japanese communications revealed a growing sense of confusion and concern among enemy commanders about the effectiveness of their fighter tactics, with several references to a ghost pilot who seemed capable of defeating superior numbers through unconventional methods that defied analysis. Japanese training manuals began to include warnings about Allied pilots who employed irregular tactics, and several experienced Zero pilots were reassigned to rear area positions after reporting encounters with British fighters that they claimed were impossible to predict or counter using standard techniques. The psychological impact of Charlie's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. By demonstrating that Allied pilots were willing to take extraordinary risks to protect each other, he had introduced an element of uncertainty into Japanese planning that would influence their air combat doctrine for the rest of the war. Charlie himself returned to operational flying within a week, his damaged Spitfire replaced by a newer aircraft that he flew with the same skill and dedication that had characterized his previous missions, but now with an additional reputation among both Allied and enemy airmen as someone who could not be counted on to follow predictable patterns. Over the following months, he completed another 37 combat missions over Burma, shooting down 6 more enemy aircraft and earning a Distinguished Flying Cross for his accumulated achievements, though the citation made no specific reference to the escort mission that had established his reputation. His fellow pilots began to notice subtle changes in Japanese fighter tactics whenever Charlie was airborne. Enemy formations seemed more cautious, more willing to break off engagements rather than press home attacks, as if the Japanese pilots had been warned about encountering a particular aircraft or pilot. Word of the March 22nd mission spread through informal channels among Allied aircrew, and Charlie found himself fielding requests from American bomber crews who specifically asked for British fighter escort when flying over particularly dangerous targets. He accommodated these requests whenever possible, often bending or breaking radio silence protocols to coordinate with bombers that found themselves in trouble, but always managing to frame his actions in terms that satisfied official requirements while providing the protection that kept Allied airmen alive. The war in Burma continued for another year, with Japanese resistance gradually crumbling as Allied forces advanced toward Rangoon, and the enemy supply lines stretched beyond their breaking point. But Charlie's unauthorized escort tactics had introduced a new element of unpredictability that Japanese planners struggled to counter effectively. When the war finally ended in August of 1945, intelligence officers on both sides began the long process of analyzing what had worked and what had failed during 4 years of aerial combat. And Charlie's March 22nd mission emerged as a case study in the power of individual initiative to overcome tactical disadvantages through unconventional thinking. After the war ended, Charlie returned to Yorkshire and his family's farm, quietly resuming his civilian life, as if the previous 6 years had been nothing more than a brief interruption in a much longer story. He married his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Pemberton, in the spring of 1946, and together they raised 3 children while he worked as a flight instructor at a nearby airfield, teaching a new generation of pilots the skills that had kept him alive through 104 combat missions. The medals and decorations gathered dust in a drawer, rarely mentioned and never displayed, though visitors to the Whitmore farm sometimes noticed a framed photograph on the mantelpiece showing 8 American airmen standing beside a shot-up B-24 bomber, their faces grinning despite the obvious battle damage to their aircraft. Charlie never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, deflecting questions with self-deprecating humor and insisting that he had simply done what any pilot would have done in the same situation, but privately he maintained correspondence with several of the men whose lives he had saved over the years. Bob Morrison, the B-24 pilot from Cleveland, became a particularly close friend, visiting the Whitmore farm several times during the 1950s and sharing stories about his post-war career as a commercial airline pilot. In one of their letters, Morrison described how he had tried to explain to his own children why a complete stranger had risked his life to save 8 Americans he had never met, and how that act of heroism had shaped his own understanding of duty and sacrifice. Other letters came from former Royal Air Force pilots who had served with Charlie in Burma, men who credited his example with inspiring them to take risks that had saved additional lives throughout the remainder of the war. Perhaps most remarkably, in 1962, Charlie received a letter written in careful English from a former Japanese Zero pilot who identified himself only as Lieutenant K and described his experience of being shot down by a British fighter on March 22, 1944. The Japanese pilot wrote that he had spent years trying to understand how one enemy aircraft had defeated his entire formation, and that he had finally concluded that the British pilot must have been either insane or possessed of supernatural skill to attempt such an audacious defensive strategy. He ended the letter by expressing his respect for an enemy who had fought with honor and courage, qualities that transcended national boundaries and political differences. The broader military establishment was slower to recognize the significance of Charlie's tactical innovations, but gradually the lessons learned from his unauthorized escort missions began to influence official doctrine and training programs. Flight schools started teaching courses on adaptive escort tactics that emphasized the importance of thinking beyond rigid formations and predetermined responses when protecting vulnerable aircraft in hostile airspace. The specific techniques Charlie had developed, using terrain masking, decoy maneuvers, and deliberate rule-breaking to confuse enemy pilots, became standard elements of advanced fighter training, though the instructors rarely mentioned the origins of these tactics or the man who had first demonstrated their effectiveness. In 1967, the Royal Air Force published a comprehensive study of air combat over Burma that included a detailed analysis of several anomalous engagements where single Allied fighters had achieved disproportionate success against superior numbers of enemy aircraft. The study's authors concluded that these victories had resulted from pilots who possessed the rare ability to recognize when conventional tactics were inadequate and the courage to improvise solutions in real time, even when doing so violated standing orders and regulations. Charlie's March 22nd mission was cited as the prime example of this type of tactical flexibility, though his name was omitted from the published version due to security classifications that remained in effect decades after the war's end. The study's conclusions influenced fighter doctrine throughout NATO and contributed to the development of more flexible training programs that encouraged pilots to think creatively about solving tactical problems rather than simply following predetermined procedures. Modern air forces around the world still study the engagement as an example of how individual initiative and moral courage can overcome numerical disadvantages when backed by superior skill and unwavering determination to protect others regardless of personal risk. As Charlie entered his 70s and 80s, he began to reflect more openly on the choices he had made during that crucial morning in 1944, particularly the moment when he decided to break radio silence and commit himself to protecting 8 strangers whose names he didn't even know. In interviews with military historians, he described the decision as arising from a simple recognition that some things mattered more than following orders, that preserving human life and honoring the bonds of trust between Allied airmen superseded any regulation or protocol that might interfere with those fundamental obligations. He often emphasized that his actions hadn't been heroic in any traditional sense, but rather the natural response of someone who understood that true military discipline sometimes required knowing when to disobey, when to think beyond the limitations imposed by higher authority, and when to trust one's own judgment over the wisdom of distant commanders who couldn't see the immediate situation unfolding in real time. The 8 American airmen whose lives he had saved maintained contact with him for decades, organizing reunions and sending Christmas cards, their children and grandchildren growing up with stories about the British pilot who had appeared from nowhere to rescue their fathers and grandfathers from certain death over the Burmese jungle. These relationships provided Charlie with a constant reminder that his split-second decision to break protocol had created ripple effects that extended far beyond a single combat engagement, touching the lives of dozens of families and influencing the choices made by subsequent generations of military aviators who understood that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting personal risk and potential punishment. When Charlie passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1998 at the age of 81, his funeral was attended by representatives from air forces around the world, including a delegation of former Japanese pilots who had specifically requested permission to pay their respects to an enemy who had earned their professional admiration through his skill and courage. The service was simple and dignified, reflecting Charlie's own preference for avoiding unnecessary attention, but the presence of so many uniformed officers from different nations testified to the lasting impact of one man's decision to place human compassion above rigid adherence to military regulations. The legacy of squadron leader Charles Whitmore's unauthorized escort mission extends far beyond the immediate tactical victory he achieved on March 22, 1944, serving as a powerful reminder that true leadership often requires the courage to act contrary to established authority when conscience and circumstances demand extraordinary measures. His decision to break radio silence and engage 6 enemy fighters to protect 8 American airmen he had never met represents the kind of moral clarity that emerges only in moments of extreme crisis. When the difference between right and wrong becomes starkly apparent and the luxury of following safe, predictable procedures gives way to the urgent necessity of preserving human life at any cost. Military academies around the world continue to study the engagement as an example of how individual initiative can overcome systemic limitations, how tactical flexibility can triumph over numerical superiority, and how the willingness to accept personal risk for the benefit of others can inspire changes in doctrine and strategy that influence military thinking for generations. The Japanese intelligence officers who spent months trying to explain how one British fighter pilot had defeated 6 of their most experienced aviators ultimately concluded that they were dealing with a new type of warfare that couldn't be countered through conventional means, a recognition that Allied pilots were no longer bound by predictable patterns and might be willing to sacrifice themselves to protect their comrades, regardless of nationality or unit affiliation. This psychological uncertainty contributed to a gradual erosion of Japanese fighter pilot morale and effectiveness, as enemy airmen began to doubt their tactical superiority and question whether their training had prepared them adequately for combat against opponents who refused to follow the established rules of engagement. Charlie's willingness to improvise, to think beyond the boundaries imposed by regulation and doctrine, and to trust his own judgment over the directives of distant authorities became a model for military leaders facing similar crises in subsequent conflicts, proving that sometimes the greatest service to one's country requires the courage to disobey orders that conflict with fundamental moral obligations to protect and defend innocent life. The question that emerged from Charlie's story, whether duty to higher authority should supersede personal conscience when human lives hang in the balance, continues to resonate with military personnel who face similar dilemmas in modern conflicts around the world. His example suggests that true discipline involves not blind obedience to regulations, but rather the wisdom to recognize when circumstances require extraordinary action and the courage to accept responsibility for the consequences of such decisions. The 8 American airmen who survived because of his choice went on to live full, productive lives, raising families, building careers, and contributing to their communities in ways that would have been impossible had they died over the Burmese jungle in 1944. Their children and grandchildren represent a living testament to the power of individual moral courage to create positive change that extends across generations.